There are sentences in the justice system that end with a number: 10 years, 25 years, 50 years. And then there are sentences that don't end at all. No date, no review, no second look. Just a quiet understanding between the court and the cage. This person is never coming back. For tens of thousands of inmates, prison is not a punishment measured in time. It is a destination, a final place, a slow, controlled disappearance carried out behind concrete walls and steel doors. These are not prisoners waiting to be released. These are prisoners waiting to die. From the outside, the system looks orderly. Clean paperwork, legal language, court transcripts, sentencing guidelines. Everything appears rational, structured, justified. But behind that paperwork is a reality so severe that most people would not last a month inside it without psychological damage. A reality where hope itself is treated as a liability. In this world, the word forever is not symbolic. It is literal. Men enter these prisons in their 20s and 30s believing they will somehow find a way out. An appeal, a law change, a miracle. Decades later, many of them no longer remember what freedom feels like. They forget the sound of traffic. They forget how it feels to touch another human being without handcuffs involved. Some forget how to hold a normal conversation at all. And the system allows it. Inside long-term isolation units and Supermax facilities, inmates can spend 22 to 24 hours a day alone. Not for weeks, not for months, but for years, sometimes decades. Meals slid through slots. Human voices reduced to commands. Eye contact replaced by surveillance cameras. The cell becomes the entire universe, 6 steps wide, 8 steps long, concrete in every direction. Psychologists have compared this level of isolation to sensory deprivation torture. Studies show it damages memory, emotional regulation, and even physical brain structure. Prisoners develop hallucinations, panic disorders, paranoia, and uncontrollable rage. Some begin talking to themselves just to prove they still exist. Others stop speaking entirely. Yet legally, this is called corrections. The most disturbing part is that many of these inmates are not actively violent. Some committed crimes decades ago. Some entered prison young, impulsive, addicted, or mentally ill. But the system does not care who they have become. It only remembers who they were at their worst moment. Once labeled irredeemable, that label never fades. Parole boards deny release year after year using the same language: nature of the crime. Not behavior, not growth, not rehabilitation. Just the past, frozen in time, unchangeable, unforgiving. The message is clear: no matter what you do, it will never be enough. Families watch helplessly as their loved ones age behind bars. Parents die before seeing their children free. Children grow up knowing their fathers only through plexiglass and phone calls that cost more than most families can afford. Eventually, the calls slow down. The visits stop. Life on the outside moves on. Inside, time doesn't move at all. This system was not built for healing. It was built for containment, for silence, for removal. It exists to make people disappear without ever calling it what it is. And society rarely questions it, because the people trapped inside are the ones we've been told not to care about. The worst of the worst. The monsters. The throwaways. Labels make it easy to stop asking hard questions. Labels make it easy to forget that every inmate is still a human being, still capable of thought, memory, regret, and pain. But what happens when a justice system stops believing in change? What happens when punishment becomes permanent policy? What happens when a prison sentence becomes a living death, sanctioned, funded, and ignored? Tonight, we are stepping inside that hidden world. A world where forgiveness does not exist, where release is not an option, where survival itself becomes a daily act of resistance. This is the prison system designed to never let go. This is locked away forever. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. The moment the judge says the words, the room usually goes silent. Not because people are shocked, but because everyone understands the weight of what has just been declared. Life without parole. Natural life. Death by incarceration. Different phrases, same meaning. This person will never walk free again. For the inmates standing in shackles, this is not just a sentence. It is the official end of a future. In the American prison system, there is a sharp and deliberate distinction between punishment and permanence. A 10-year sentence implies return. Even 20 or 30 years still carries the idea that one day, freedom is possible. But a sentence with no parole, no review, no reconsideration is something else entirely. It is a declaration that the system has finished with you, not just for now, but forever. From that moment on, every part of the inmate's existence changes. Transfers happen quickly. Property is stripped down to essentials. Personal clothing is replaced with standardized prison uniforms. Names are replaced with numbers. Court documents are sealed away, never to be revisited unless new laws emerge, which rarely happens. Within days or weeks, many of these inmates are shipped to facilities specifically designed for permanent confinement. Places like ADX Florence exist for one purpose: total control. Often misunderstood as just high security, these prisons are something far more extreme. They are built around the assumption that inmates will never reintegrate into society, so there is no incentive to prepare them for it. Education programs are minimal. Vocational training is almost non-existent. Therapy, when it exists, is limited and tightly controlled. Why invest in rehabilitation when release is not part of the plan? For inmates sentenced to life without parole, the intake process alone is psychologically devastating. Many arrive believing, despite the sentence, that something will change. A future appeal, a law reform, a successful motion. But during intake, prison staff make it clear, this facility is your last stop. Guards don't say it cruelly. They don't need to. It's implied in the way the rules are explained, in the absence of any mention of parole or reentry, in the casual way staff talk about long-term housing and end-of-life medical units. In some prisons, inmates serving permanent sentences are placed in separate housing blocks. These units are quieter, older, and often more isolated. The system does not expect movement here. These are static populations, men who will age, decline, and die within the same walls they entered. One former corrections officer described it bluntly. Everyone knows who's never leaving. We don't say it, but we know. Inside these units, time behaves differently. Days are structured, repetitive, and rigid. Wake-up counts, meal counts, yard schedules that rarely change. Weeks blur into months, months into years. Birthdays stop matching. Holidays lose meaning. The calendar becomes irrelevant because there is nothing ahead to count down toward. The first psychological collapse often happens within the first 5 years. Inmates begin to realize that good behavior will not earn them freedom. Educational certificates will not shorten their sentence. Therapy will not lead to release. The motivation that drives most prisoners, get out, does not exist here. And when hope disappears, behavior changes. Some inmates become hyper-compliant, doing everything possible to avoid trouble, not because they expect reward, but because punishment is the only variable left. Others spiral into anger and defiance, lashing out at staff or other inmates because consequences no longer matter. A write-up means nothing when you already have a life sentence. This is one of the most dangerous truths about permanent incarceration. It removes incentives for rehabilitation while amplifying despair. In facilities like Louisiana State Penitentiary, thousands of inmates serve life sentences on land that once symbolized forced labor and human ownership. Angola is often described as a prison town, complete with its own cemetery, because many inmates will be buried there. For decades, parole was almost non-existent, turning the prison into a place where generations of men lived out entire lifetimes behind bars. Many arrived young, 18, 19, 20 years old. Now they are in their 60s, 70s, even 80s. They have outlived the judges who sentenced them, the prosecutors who argued against them, and sometimes even the laws under which they were convicted. But the sentence remains. Medical care becomes the final chapter of these lives. Chronic illness is common. Mental health deteriorates further. Prison hospitals and infirmaries quietly become hospice wards. Inmates die under guard, often with no family present, sometimes with no one at all. And outside the walls, no one notices. The public rarely thinks about inmates serving permanent sentences unless a high-profile case makes the news. Politicians gain nothing by advocating for people labeled as irredeemable. Media coverage favors trials and verdicts, not the slow decades that follow. The system depends on this invisibility. Yet the cost, both financial and human, is enormous. Housing an aging inmate population costs exponentially more than younger prisoners. Medical treatment, security, and specialized housing strain budgets. But the system continues anyway, because reversing a life sentence requires admitting that permanent punishment may have been a mistake. And the system does not admit mistakes easily. For the inmates themselves, the hardest realization is not the loss of freedom, it is the loss of identity. When there is no future to imagine, the mind retreats inward. Some inmates stop speaking to others entirely. Some cling to rigid routines as a way to impose control over a life that no longer belongs to them. Others become institutionalized to the point where the outside world becomes frightening rather than desirable. They cannot imagine navigating technology, society, or relationships beyond prison walls. Freedom becomes abstract, unreal, dangerous. This is the silent consequence of sentencing someone to never return. The system does not just remove them from society. It reshapes them into something that no longer belongs anywhere else. And this is only the beginning. Because once an inmate is sentenced to forever, the prison does not simply hold them. It manages their decline, their isolation, their disappearance. In the next chapter, we will step deeper inside the architecture of permanent confinement, into the cells, corridors, and control systems designed not for correction, but for containment until death. This is not about punishment anymore. This is about erasure. Prisons were not always built like this. Older prisons, stone fortresses, iron bars, large cell blocks, were designed to hold bodies. Modern Supermax prisons are designed to control minds. Every inch of their architecture serves a psychological purpose. Nothing is accidental. Nothing is humane by coincidence. These facilities are not places where people live. They are environments engineered to reduce human beings into manageable, predictable units. When inmates sentenced to permanent incarceration arrive at facilities like ADX Florence, they are not entering a prison in the traditional sense. They are entering a closed system, one that assumes they will never leave and therefore does not need to preserve their ability to function as normal human beings. The cell is the foundation of this system. A typical Supermax cell measures roughly 7 by 12 feet. Concrete walls, concrete floor, concrete ceiling. The bed is a concrete slab molded into the wall. The desk is concrete. The stool is concrete. The sink and toilet are stainless steel, fused into a single unit to prevent tampering. There are no sharp edges, because everything is already a weapon against the mind. The door is solid steel. There are no bars to look through. Instead, there is a narrow slit of reinforced glass, often positioned so that inmates cannot see out unless they stand at a precise angle. Below it sits the food slot, opened and closed remotely. Meals are delivered without conversation, sometimes without eye contact, sometimes without a single spoken word for days. This is intentional. Human interaction is the most dangerous variable in a Supermax environment. Conversations lead to bonds. Bonds lead to resistance. Resistance leads to loss of control. So the system removes interaction almost entirely. Inmates in permanent confinement spend 22 to 24 hours a day inside these cells. Recreation, when allowed, often takes place alone in a concrete enclosure known as a dog run, a narrow outdoor cage with walls too high to see over and a ceiling of metal mesh. No grass, no horizon, no sense of space, just enough sky to remind inmates that the world continues without them. Sound is controlled. Silence is enforced. Unlike older prisons filled with noise, shouting, clanging doors, movement, Supermax units are eerily quiet. Footsteps echo down long corridors. Doors open and close with hydraulic precision. Guards communicate via radios and control panels, often unseen by inmates. The absence of sound becomes oppressive. Many inmates report that silence itself becomes a form of punishment, amplifying anxiety and paranoia. Lighting is another weapon. Cells are illuminated 24 hours a day. The lights may dim slightly at night, but they never fully turn off. This disrupts circadian rhythms, sleep cycles, and mental stability. Over time, inmates lose their sense of day and night. Insomnia becomes chronic. Hallucinations become common. There are no mirrors in most cells. No reflective surfaces. Inmates can go months or years without seeing their own face. Some report feeling as if they are slowly disappearing, physically and psychologically. Surveillance is constant. Every cell is monitored by cameras. Every movement is recorded. Inmates know they are always being watched, yet they rarely see the people watching them. This imbalance creates a powerful psychological effect, complete vulnerability without reciprocal visibility. The inmate is exposed. The system remains hidden. In facilities like Pelican Bay State Prison, this architecture was refined to an extreme. For years, inmates were held in security housing units, SHUs, under conditions so isolating that international human rights organizations compared them to torture. Some prisoners spent decades without meaningful human contact, their confinement justified not by behavior, but by alleged gang affiliation or administrative classification. The architecture made resistance almost impossible. There are no shared spaces, no communal dining halls, no group programs. Movement is conducted through sealed corridors known as sally ports, where only one door opens at a time. Inmates are shackled every time they leave their cell, hands, waist, feet, regardless of age or physical condition. This level of control does something profound to the human brain. Neuroscientists and psychologists have documented the effects of prolonged isolation: memory loss, emotional flattening, impulsive rage, depression, panic attacks, and psychosis. The brain, deprived of stimulation, begins to turn inward. Thoughts loop endlessly. Fears magnify. Reality becomes unstable. Some inmates report hearing voices. Others report seeing movement in the walls. Many develop obsessive behaviors: pacing, tapping, counting steps, rituals that provide a sense of control in an environment designed to remove it. And for those sentenced to never be released, there is no endpoint to this experience. Unlike inmates in segregation for disciplinary reasons, permanent confinement prisoners have no countdown, no date when conditions improve, no promise of transfer. This is not temporary isolation. It is structural isolation built into the sentence itself. The prison does not expect them to recover. From an administrative perspective, this architecture is considered efficient. Fewer fights, fewer staff injuries, predictable routines. Inmates become manageable, quiet, contained. But that quiet comes at a cost. As years turn into decades, many inmates lose basic social skills. Eye contact becomes uncomfortable. Conversations feel threatening. Even when allowed limited interaction, such as medical appointments or legal visits, some inmates struggle to speak coherently. Words come slowly. Emotions surface unpredictably. The architecture has done its job. It has not corrected behavior. It has not rehabilitated. It has rewired. And perhaps most disturbing of all is how normal this has become. These prisons operate legally. They are funded publicly. They are inspected, regulated, and defended in court. Judges sentence people into these environments knowing exactly what they are. Legislators approve budgets knowing the outcomes. Society accepts the results because the people inside have been labeled unworthy of concern. But architecture does not judge guilt or innocence. It only enforces permanence. In the next chapter, we will examine what prolonged isolation does to the human mind and why many inmates serving permanent sentences do not simply suffer psychologically, but fundamentally change in ways that can never be undone. This is what happens when a prison is not designed to release people, but to outlast them. There is a moment in permanent confinement that few inmates can clearly describe, but almost all of them experience. It happens quietly. There is no alarm, no breakdown, no dramatic collapse. It is the moment the mind realizes there is no finish line. Not tomorrow, not in 10 years, not ever. From that point on, survival becomes psychological rather than physical. Human beings are not designed for isolation. Our brains evolved through interaction: faces, voices, movement, unpredictability. When those inputs are removed, the brain does not rest. It malfunctions. And in prisons built for permanent confinement, that malfunction is not a side effect. It is an outcome. In the early months of isolation, inmates often report heightened alertness. Every sound feels important. Every footstep outside the cell signals danger or relief. Time feels slow, but manageable. Hope still exists in fragments, appeals, outside attention, imagined futures. But over time, something changes. The brain begins to conserve energy by narrowing its focus. Thoughts loop. Memories replay uncontrollably. Regret becomes obsessive. Anger has nowhere to go and turns inward. Sleep fractures into short, restless cycles interrupted by anxiety and artificial light. This is the beginning of cognitive erosion. Psychologists have documented that prolonged isolation reduces the brain's ability to process external stimuli. Concentration weakens. Reading becomes difficult. Simple tasks, following instructions, maintaining a conversation, require intense effort. Inmates describe feeling mentally foggy, as if parts of their mind have gone offline. And this is not rare. Studies cited by organizations such as the American Psychological Association consistently show that long-term solitary confinement causes measurable psychological harm. Depression, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress, and psychosis occur at rates dramatically higher than in the general prison population. But numbers don't capture the lived reality. Inmates begin to hear things that aren't there. A voice calling their name. A door opening. Music playing faintly in the distance. Some know these sounds are not real. Others do not. Hallucinations become part of daily life, woven seamlessly into reality. Paranoia follows. When you are watched constantly but rarely see another person, the mind fills in the gaps. Inmates become convinced guards are plotting against them, that cameras are focused specifically on their thoughts, that other inmates can hear them through the walls. Without human interaction to challenge these beliefs, delusions grow unchecked. Emotional regulation collapses. Minor frustrations, late meals, miscommunication, a denied request, can trigger explosive rage. Not because the inmate is violent by nature, but because their emotional range has narrowed to extremes. Calm becomes difficult to maintain when the nervous system is locked in a constant state of alert. At the same time, many inmates experience emotional flattening. They stop feeling joy, sadness, excitement, or anticipation. Life becomes a gray blur of routine and endurance. This state, often described as psychological numbness, is the brain's last defense against overwhelming stress. It is also one of the most dangerous. Numbness erodes identity. Inmates lose their sense of who they are beyond their sentence. Past achievements feel unreal. Relationships feel distant, even imaginary. Some stop recognizing themselves as part of the outside world at all. They refer to it as out there, as if it belongs to another species. Language deteriorates. Without conversation, speech becomes unnecessary. Words shrink. Sentences shorten. Some inmates report struggling to find vocabulary during rare visits or legal calls. Others feel overwhelmed by speech altogether, retreating into silence because talking feels exhausting. This is not a failure of willpower. It is neurological adaptation. The human brain adapts to its environment, even when that environment is destructive. For inmates sentenced to permanent confinement, there is no recovery phase, no reintegration program, no gradual return to social life. The damage accumulates year after year, untreated or misunderstood. Mental health services in these facilities are often limited. Therapy sessions may occur through cell doors. Medications are prescribed quickly, adjusted slowly, and rarely accompanied by consistent counseling. Psychiatrists rotate in and out. Continuity of care is rare. And when inmates deteriorate, the response is often more isolation. Self-harm becomes common, not always as a suicide attempt, but as a grounding mechanism. Physical pain confirms existence. Blood becomes proof of reality. For some, it is the only sensation strong enough to cut through numbness. Suicide attempts occur at significantly higher rates in isolation units than in general population housing. Some succeed. Others fail and are returned to the same conditions that drove them to the act in the first place. This creates a closed loop of suffering. Perhaps the most disturbing effect of permanent isolation is institutional dependency. After years or decades, some inmates become psychologically incapable of functioning outside extreme structure. Choice becomes terrifying. Open spaces feel threatening. Unpredictability induces panic. These individuals are not rehabilitated. They are conditioned. Even if release were suddenly offered, many would struggle to survive it. This reality challenges the core justification of permanent confinement. If the system claims these inmates are too dangerous to release, yet actively subjects them to conditions that worsen mental instability, what is the true goal? Control? Containment? Or quiet removal from society? From the outside, these prisons appear calm, orderly, controlled. Inside, They are psychological pressure chambers, slowly dismantling the human mind under the authority of law. And the most unsettling truth is this: once the damage is done, it cannot be undone. In the next chapter, we will examine how the system justifies this level of suffering, and why permanent incarceration persists despite overwhelming evidence of harm. This is not just about punishment anymore. It is about what happens when a society decides some minds are expendable. Permanent incarceration does not survive on cruelty alone. It survives on paperwork, court opinions, sentencing statutes, risk assessments, parole board transcripts, legal language so dense and procedural that the human cost disappears between the lines. This is how a system designed to never forgive protects itself, by transforming irreversible punishment into something that looks reasonable, lawful, and necessary. At the center of this system is a simple idea: some people are beyond redemption. Judges rarely say it directly. Instead, they rely on phrases like the nature of the offense, irreparable harm, or ongoing threat to society. These words carry enormous weight. Once written into a sentencing order, they follow an inmate for the rest of their life, resurfacing at every review, every appeal, every denied motion. The crime becomes frozen in time. It does not matter how old the inmate is now. It does not matter who they have become. It does not matter what decades of confinement have done to them. The system does not reassess people. It reassesses paperwork. Life without parole sentences expanded dramatically during the tough-on-crime era of the late 20th century. Legislators promised safety. Prosecutors promised certainty. Victims' families were told this was the only way to guarantee justice. And for a time, the public accepted that logic without question. But what was rarely discussed was what forever actually means in practice. A life without parole sentence removes the very mechanism that most legal systems depend on to correct errors and excesses: review. Parole boards exist to evaluate growth, remorse, behavior, and rehabilitation. When parole is removed, the sentence becomes static, immune to change, immune to evidence of transformation. In states that still conduct parole hearings for life-sentenced inmates, the process itself often reveals how forgiveness is structurally impossible. Parole boards are not courts. They do not retry cases. They do not reassess guilt. Instead, they focus heavily, sometimes exclusively, on the original offense. Transcripts show the same pattern repeated year after year. Board members reading aloud crime details, asking inmates to relive their worst moments, then denying release because the crime remains too severe. This creates a paradox. The inmate is told to show growth, remorse, and accountability, yet is punished for the fact that the past cannot be changed. No amount of self-improvement can undo a murder, a violent act, or a catastrophic decision made decades earlier. The board acknowledges progress, then denies release anyway. In effect, parole becomes theater. For inmates sentenced to permanent confinement, the situation is even more stark. There is no hearing, no evaluation, no future checkpoint. The sentence assumes that change is irrelevant. Appeals offer little relief. Most appeals focus on procedural errors, ineffective counsel, or constitutional violations. They are time-limited and tightly constrained. New evidence must meet extraordinary standards. Legal deadlines are unforgiving. One missed filing can permanently close the door. Even when evidence of rehabilitation is overwhelming, courts often rule it legally irrelevant. This logic has been reinforced repeatedly at the highest levels. While the United States Supreme Court has placed some limits on life without parole sentences for juveniles, adults receive almost no protection. The underlying assumption remains intact. Once an adult commits a sufficiently serious crime, society owes them nothing beyond basic survival. The system frames this as fairness. Victims deserve closure. Communities deserve safety. The punishment must match the crime. But closure is not the same as healing. Many victims' families have publicly stated that permanent incarceration did not bring peace. Instead, it prolonged trauma by keeping the case alive indefinitely: appeals, hearings, anniversaries, and constant reminders. Others support permanent sentences, believing release would dishonor their loss. The system uses both positions to justify itself. What it does not address is the cost of refusing to forgive. Permanent incarceration shifts the burden forward in time. It creates an aging prison population with complex medical needs. It transforms correctional officers into hospice guards. It turns prisons into long-term care facilities surrounded by razor wire. And when inmates deteriorate mentally, the system responds with further control rather than reassessment. Mental illness does not reopen cases. Cognitive decline does not reduce sentences. Dementia does not trigger compassion. An inmate can forget their own crime and still be punished for it. Legally, this is acceptable. Administratively, it is convenient. Morally, it is deeply unsettling. Perhaps the most powerful justification for permanent incarceration is fear. Fear of political backlash, fear of rare but devastating failures, fear of being blamed if a released inmate reoffends. For parole boards, judges, and governors, denial is the safest option. Keeping someone locked away guarantees that nothing bad can happen outside the prison walls. Risk avoidance becomes policy. This leads to what criminologists call defensive decision-making. Choices made not on fairness or evidence, but on minimizing personal and institutional risk. Granting release carries consequences. Denying it rarely does. So the default becomes no. No parole, no commutation, no reconsideration. The system tells itself that permanence equals safety. But safety for whom? Communities are not made safer by warehousing elderly, infirm inmates who no longer resemble the person they once were. Justice is not strengthened by refusing to acknowledge change. And a system that cannot forgive eventually loses the ability to judge proportionately. Yet permanent incarceration persists because it is invisible. Trials are public. Sentences are reported. What happens afterward unfolds slowly, quietly, behind walls the public never sees. Decades of isolation, decline, and death do not make headlines. They do not trend. They do not provoke outrage, because they are designed not to be noticed. Forever works only if no one is watching. In the next chapter, we will confront the final consequence of a system that never forgives. What happens when inmates grow old, sick, and die behind bars, and how permanent punishment reshapes not just prisoners, but the society that enforces it. This is the cost of believing that some people are beyond redemption. Permanent incarceration does not end with violence, riots, or dramatic final moments. Most of the time, it ends quietly, in hospital beds, infirmary cells, and hospice units tucked deep inside prison grounds. No headlines, no crowds, just the slow shutdown of a body that never left custody. This is the final phase of a system that never forgives. For inmates sentenced to life without parole or de facto life sentences, aging is not a natural process. It is a controlled one. Every year lived behind bars accelerates decline. Poor nutrition, chronic stress, lack of sunlight, limited movement, and untreated mental illness combine to age prisoners faster than people on the outside. A 50-year-old inmate often has the health profile of someone in their late 60s or 70s. By the time many reach old age, their crimes are decades behind them, but their punishment is not. In places like Louisiana State Penitentiary, death has become routine. Angola is one of the largest maximum security prisons in the United States, and for much of its history, parole for lifers was nearly non-existent. The result is a prison population that grows old together and dies together. The prison has its own cemetery. Rows of small, numbered grave markers sit on prison land. Many of the men buried there had no family left to claim their bodies. Others had families too far away, too poor, or too emotionally exhausted to come. In death, as in life, the system handled everything. Inside the prison, aging inmates are slowly transferred from general housing to medical units. At first, it's subtle: extra medications, mobility aids, frequent clinic visits. Then it becomes unavoidable. Wheelchairs appear, walkers, oxygen tanks. The same men once labeled the worst of the worst now struggle to stand, to remember names, to control their hands. But the sentence does not change. Correctional officers become caregivers by default. They escort inmates to dialysis. They wait outside exam rooms. They stand watch while nurses administer morphine. Many officers admit privately that guarding dying men feels nothing like public safety. It feels like custodial caretaking. Prison hospice programs now exist in several states, created not out of compassion, but necessity. The cost of transporting terminally ill inmates to outside hospitals is high. Keeping them inside is cheaper, easier, and legally safer. Hospice units inside prisons look nothing like those on the outside. Security remains constant. Doors stay locked. Restraints are often used even when inmates are too weak to lift their arms. Visits, if allowed, are brief and heavily supervised. For some inmates, hospice is the first time in decades they experience sustained human contact. Volunteer inmate caregivers, often serving long sentences themselves, sit with the dying, talk to them, feed them, clean them, and listen to final regrets. These caregivers report hearing the same themes over and over again: remorse, loneliness, unresolved grief, and disbelief that life ended this way. "I never thought this would be it," one inmate reportedly said. "I always thought something would change. It never did." Dementia and cognitive decline introduce another moral contradiction. Inmates forget rules, forget faces, forget where they are. Some forget their own crimes entirely. They ask why they're in prison. They ask when they're going home. The system answers with silence. Legally, diminished capacity does not invalidate a sentence. An inmate who no longer understands punishment is still subject to it. An inmate who cannot remember committing a crime is still punished for it daily. This is not hypothetical. It happens regularly. Alzheimer's units inside prisons are growing. Special housing is created not to rehabilitate, but to manage confusion. Guards receive minimal training in elder care. Mental health support is inconsistent. The environment remains rigid and institutional, even as inmates lose the ability to navigate it. Families who visit elderly inmates often leave shaken. They see parents and grandparents who no longer resemble the person they knew. Men who once projected toughness now struggle to speak. Conversations revolve around pain, medication schedules, and memories that may or may not be accurate. And still, release is denied. Compassionate release laws technically exist in many states, allowing terminally ill inmates to be freed under strict conditions. In practice, these releases are rare. The approval process is slow. Medical criteria are narrow. Political risk discourages decision-makers from granting them. Many inmates die waiting for paperwork. From an administrative perspective, keeping inmates until death avoids controversy. A dead prisoner cannot reoffend, cannot embarrass the system, cannot generate headlines. So death becomes the default resolution. The financial cost is enormous. Geriatric inmates cost 2 to 3 times more to house than younger prisoners due to medical care, specialized housing, and staffing needs. Yet the system continues because admitting the alternative, that permanent incarceration may be excessive, would require confronting decades of policy decisions. The human cost is harder to quantify. Permanent incarceration reshapes how society understands justice. When punishment extends beyond any meaningful purpose, it stops being about accountability and becomes about endurance. The prison becomes a warehouse for unwanted lives, and death becomes an administrative outcome rather than a moral reckoning. Perhaps the most disturbing truth is this: many inmates who die behind bars pose no realistic threat to anyone. They are frail, confused, immobilized. Their continued confinement serves no protective function. It simply satisfies a sentence written long ago. And yet, the system insists on finishing what it started. As the body fails, the cell remains the same. Concrete walls, steel doors, artificial light, surveillance cameras watching even the final breaths. Death certificates list natural causes, but the conditions that accelerated those deaths are rarely acknowledged. The prison closes the file, another number removed from the count. Outside, the world continues unaware. In the final chapter, we will step back and ask the hardest question of all: what does a system that never forgives say about the society that built it, and whether permanent punishment ultimately protects us or diminishes us? Because in the end, this story is not just about prisoners. It is about us. When the gates finally close for the last time, there is no sound that carries beyond the walls. No announcement, no acknowledgement, just a silent continuation of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Permanent incarceration is not loud. It does not shock. It does not explode into headlines. It works quietly, slowly, and efficiently, measured not in days or years, but in lifetimes. It is a punishment that does not end when justice is served, because justice, in this system, is never finished. We have seen what forever looks like. It begins in courtrooms, where sentences are handed down with certainty and confidence. It continues in concrete cells built to contain bodies and dismantle minds. It deepens in isolation units where silence becomes a weapon and hope becomes a liability. And it ends in infirmaries, hospice wings, and prison cemeteries, where punishment outlives purpose. The system tells us this is necessary, that safety requires permanence, that forgiveness is weakness. But the evidence tells a more uncomfortable story. A system that never reconsiders also never corrects itself. A system that refuses to forgive cannot measure growth. And a system that equates accountability with permanent suffering eventually stops asking whether it is still delivering justice or merely enforcing tradition. Permanent incarceration does not ask who a person has become. It only remembers who they were at their worst moment. And in doing so, it asks society to accept something profound, that change is irrelevant, that redemption is impossible, and that some lives are only valuable as warnings to others. This documentary was not about excusing crime. It was not about erasing harm. It was about confronting what happens after punishment becomes endless. Because behind every life sentence is a human being aging in a place designed to forget them. Behind every concrete cell is a moral decision made long ago and never revisited. And behind every locked door is a question we rarely ask out loud. What does a justice system that never forgives say about us? If punishment has no end, does it still protect society, or does it simply harden it? If redemption is impossible, what incentive remains for anyone to change? And if death behind bars is the expected outcome, should we at least be honest about what that means? These are not abstract questions. They are happening right now, every day, in prisons across the country, out of sight, out of mind, and fully within the law. Locked away forever, not just from society, but from the possibility of being seen as human again. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.